All right, welcome everybody. My name is Joe Kelly. I'm with the West Ashley Democrats, and this is part of our series of brunches during Black History Month, where we were talking with various folks around town who are experts on Black history. And we have with us today Professor Michael Owens from the College of Charleston. And in particular, he teaches a number of different courses, including in the Spectra program in the summer, which comes up in the book. Hopefully, maybe we can talk a little bit about that too. We've invited him onto this program because of the book he wrote. And let me share my screen. The name of the book is Burned: Conversations with a Black World War II Veteran. The veteran is Rollins Edwards, and it is based on, it's just tons of interviews, oral histories that Michael did with Mr. Edwards. And I can tell you right now, this is just an absolutely fantastic read. As you can see on the screen there, it has every single person who has reviewed this book has given it 5 stars on Amazon. So I very highly recommend that you, if you're intrigued by this conversation, that you go to Amazon, get the book, and please review it too, because I know, Michael, those, as horrible as it is to admit it, those Amazon reviews really, they alter the algorithms and things. So if you do buy the book and you like it, please give it a good review on Amazon. Okay. Michael, thanks for coming. I really appreciate your being with us today.
Thank you.
Let me just jump in first of all with a question. I want to eventually come back to your role in the book, but let's of course focus on Rollins Edwards in the beginning. Can you introduce him to us? Where was he born? Where did he grow up? Just a little bit about his early life.
And as I introduce him, I can kind of hear his voice in my head because I spent a lot of time with him, over 5 years. So at sometimes if I pause or anything, I'm kind of thinking about him as I'm talking about this. But he was born in 1922, and I can hear him right now on Pigeon Bay Road in Somerville. And he would tell you that, growing up as a child, he had a great childhood for a poor kid, he would say. Few years, when he became an adult, he got drafted into the military, and that's kind of when his life began to change. And that was just the beginning. From then on, he did a number of things that I'm sure we'll talk about. But he was a very, and I'm speaking in past tense because he passed away in 2017, but he was a very straightforward man, very honest, and that's what I admired about him, because in today's society, you don't get a lot of true honesty, just face value. So, and the fact that he was a World War II veteran, an African American World War II veteran, I had never even met a African American World War II veteran, and
Yeah.
I just kind of thought that was weird because I grew up in Black neighborhoods. I went to predominantly Black schools. I was in the Black Student Union. I involved in the NAACP, Black Brain Bowl, Black this, Black that, and never even met an African American World War II veteran. So meeting him literally changed my life.
Yeah, and once we do get into the details of his service, at one and the same time, I mean, he's kind of unique in several ways, as we'll get into, but he's also sort of representative of the experience of a lot of people. So he's we'll let's just wait a second to get into those details, because before we start talking about his service in World War II, I do want to ask you, there's one incident really sticks out in my mind of his school days, and it comes later in the book.
Right.
But if I'm remembering correctly, the essays the students write, of course, this is in days of segregation, and
Right.
he would have been going to an all-Black school. And when they wrote essays, they had to send those essays up to the white school to have a white teacher grade those essays, as if a Black teacher was not,
Right.
I guess, capable of doing it. And one time he was assigned the task of delivering the essays to the white school. Can you tell us what happened next?
So he was assigned the task, like you said, to deliver these papers. So he went over to the white school, and as he walked in, you know, automatically, just the nature of society at that point, he was already kind of ridiculed just for even coming into the class. And one of the students threw an eraser back then, you know, had the chalkboard. Now you have smart boards and whatnot, but chalkboard, and threw the eraser and hit him in the head, and there's dust everywhere. And Mr. Edwards, he really didn't back down from much. So he picked up a paperweight that was on the teacher's desk, like a really solid paperweight, and just threw it at the guy. Luckily, thank goodness, the guy ducked and it hit the wall and put a hole in the wall. But everybody reprimanded Mr. Edwards, and he was saying, you know, hey, he started it. It's not my fault, but he's the one that got in trouble. So he was really kind of upset about that. But that was kind of an everyday sort of thing. And the fact that even as a teacher, I teach writing also. So to imagine that I spend all of my energy teaching my students how to write, how to structure their essays and whatnot, and then I have to let someone else grade them. I mean, although it's less work, it's still kind of, you know, insulting that I'm good enough to teach my students, but not good enough to grade their papers. So stories like that, I had no idea about those sort of. You always hear about the things about like the bus or water fountains and restrooms, but just basic going to school, writing on paper. Blacks weren't even allowed to grade the paper, so that was kind of interesting to learn about.
Yeah, to hear about you know, the multiplicity of indignities, and this is why this particular episode I think stood out in my mind so much is at least as he comes across as a character in your book, Mr. Edwards was not one to suffer indignities. I mean, he was a feisty individual who was going to stand up for his rights, and that even as a school age kid, you know, he's that character trait really comes out. Then of course it comes out in the service as well. So he, you know, as a very young man, he's working for the Navy. So he wants to, you know, he wants to join up and join the Navy. I mean, he goes to the recruitment center, and all the services are represented there. It's kind of weird how he ends up in the Army, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
He thought, he really didn't know. He thought he could choose, which is interesting. I want to go to, and they literally said, nope, this line has less people, go to that line. He's like, no, I want to be in the Navy. They're like, we don't care what you want to do. You're going in the Army. And that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah. And that's what really, I mean, that sets in motion the events that make him a truly historic figure, I think, in sort of the grand sense of history. I think he's a historic figure in other ways as well. But he gets shipped off to Fort Claiborne in Louisiana,
Camp
right?
Claiborne,
And Camp Claiborne, and then and can you tell us about his experience there? Because this is, you know, what is, I think, going to blow people's minds.
So there's so much involved. I don't want to get too detailed in it, but he went there. First of all, he was a very smart young man. He skipped several grades and whatnot. So when he went to the camp, he took these tests. He scored really high, but as a black man, he wasn't allowed to go to officer training school. So they just allowed him to train and help people that couldn't read, to help them read. Well, after that, he didn't have much to do. So one day he was just sitting around, and they just kind of said, hey, get on a truck. You know, there wasn't a lot of explanation. Even now in the military, that's just the culture. Get on this truck. We're going to go somewhere. He's like, well, where am I going? I don't know. Where am I going? We don't know. Just get on the truck. Lo and behold, he goes deep into the woods in Camp Claiborne, and just to put it in general aspects, he was, just to get right to it, tortured. He faced a lot of indignities, as you said, but when I tell students and share with people that, yes, he was tortured, they automatically go, oh, so the Germans. I'm like, no, this was America, his own officers. And when I say tortured, I mean gas chambers, different chemicals, sleeping gas, Lewisite gas, mustard gas, gases I have never even heard of, all for the sake of science, just in case if Hitler decided to use or weapons of mass destruction, you know, gas, they wanted to be prepared. So, lo and behold, they didn't use mustard gas. It was kind of a, oops, our bad. But,
Yeah.
and also the
And
idea of being sworn to secrecy as well.
yeah, and all these experiments were based on this, sort of, I mean, in absurd notion that the skin of African Americans is somehow fundamentally different than the skin of white people, right? So they thought, okay, well, maybe we can send our African American soldiers into a mustard gas battlefield or something, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting because initially they thought that African Americans weren't smart enough to fight, not disciplined enough. Their jobs, even if you research it now, cooks, digging ditches, things like that, bringing supplies in and out. However, if you had this magical superpower and if your skin was thicker, which they did think that, I've looked at the records and the research, these are professional scientists and medical practitioners
Yeah.
thought that black skin was thicker. Well, if that was the case, we'll put you on the front lines, and now you're able to fight. So they did the experiments, and like I said, they decided, oops, our bad, we were wrong. But by then, these guys are all messed up. There's chemicals raging through their bodies, and that lasts a lifetime. And I believe Mr. Edwards was the only survivor, the last survivor of those guys to make it.
Yeah, yeah. And as the last survivor, the only survivor, I mean, it's his testimony that is telling us what actually happened, and this particularly horrible episode in American history. And we usually think of, that it's the good war, is how it's often portrayed, but obviously there's a lot of bad stuff that went on. And if he didn't tell the story, we wouldn't really know this story, right? I mean, it was up to him.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, he's going to have to deal with this for the rest of his life. He has these outbreaks, and they come and go. And at not long after this, he gets shipped off to the European theater of operations, right? So he's experiencing the war over there.
The war in Europe, well, like I said, before he even got started, he's already has these chemicals raging through his body. He, like you said, he has these breakouts. And I just want to pause with you for a second because I would hear him talk about these breakouts and his skin. But one of the first interviews I had with him, I sat down with him and he pulled out a bag and he just held this up. And he's like, "Do you know what this is?" And of course, I was like, "I have no idea what that is." And I know this is a brunch thing, but to show you how detrimental this was and how atrocious this was, he said, "Well, this is how much skin fell off my body in one night." And I was like, "What?" And my initial judgment reflex was, "Oh my God, that's gross. How did you do that? That's oh." And then I started to think, what would make a man carry around a jar of dried skin? Like what would make him do that? Well, it's because nobody believed him. The doctors didn't believe him. No one believed this happened. So he would carry this around and say, "Yeah, go ahead and test it. Test my DNA. Test that these things happen to me." So when I show that to people, their reaction is kind of like mine initially. It's like, whoa. And then they realize, wow, that makes it real. That makes it, more, it's like, wow. So um, those are the type of chemicals that are in his body all throughout military service. So in Europe, he often compared Europe and the Pacific. He said basically Europe was kind of like a vacation compared to the Pacific, but Europe, there were a number of things. He met General Patton, well, not met him, but came across him. He had other atrocities happen to him, teeth getting pulled, more experiments. And again, the mustard gas is still in his body. He's getting sick every other day. Once they found that out, they really didn't force him to do work. They just kind of said, "Hey, we know you're sick," but they would not send him home. They would just not. Rather than send him home, they send him to the Pacific.
Yeah, even so, VE Day comes around and the war's over in Europe, but he doesn't get to go home. He gets on a boat. They send him down through the Panama Canal, and out to the Philippines, I think it was. Is that where he went at first? And I mean, just one. I've got a quotation from your book from one of the things that he said. He said it was war in Europe, but it was hell in the Pacific. and just to suggest that there's something worse than war.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that just I don't. Again, this is brunch.
Mm,
We don't want to get too graphic about things, but we don't want to tiptoe around this stuff too
right.
much either. I mean, there's some vivid descriptions of flamethrower warfare
Right.
in the Pacific that is just kind of horrifying. Um, and part of that too, he says, and this is one of the things that I think make him a really remarkable testifier about the war and about the experience. He said, get a bunch of soldiers together, a bunch of fellas, and they can do some things. I'll be honest, I was not an angel. That's the temperament the Army wanted. It brought out a lot of hatred in me.
Mm,
Um, can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about the experience in the Pacific and what he's getting at with that?
Yeah, that quote stuck out to me as well.
Yeah.
Well, you have to imagine the context of these guys. A lot of them, most of them come from small, segregated towns. They've been oppressed their whole lives. They've faced all sorts of things, and now you put them in an army and say, "Go kill people." And he said a lot of them are like thugs and just kind of waiting to do something. So you put a lot of guys like that together. They're hungry. They're constant under constant stress. Fights break out, things happen. He didn't go into a lot of detail, but sometimes they drew guns on each other. Sometimes they were like he said, evil. I remember one incident they were in a taxi and it was a white cab driver and he made a racial remark to the guys and they just beat him up, pulverized him, and threw him out the car. So that sort of thing. But for him, the fact that he was tested, that they kept him in the war. The Philippines was hell because all he wanted to do was just get back home. And in the army, there are no morals. They were just trying to survive. And no one likes to kill. No one likes to act violently. But if it's you or them. And at the time, they were fighting the Japanese in the Philippines, and they were vigilant fighters. They did not quit. They did not surrender. And the only way to stop them, and I remember another quote he says, what do you do when a man doesn't care about his life? He's just coming at you. What do you do? So there are a lot of things I know that he thought about, things that he did just to survive. And I could only imagine
Yeah.
that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. So, in many ways, the experiences that we've talked about, I mean, certainly not unique to him, but I mean, not many people had to go through the kind of trials that he went through. I mean, he's a larger than life figure. He is somebody who experienced things that almost nobody else did, and he came through and he survived, and not only survived but thrived in his lifetime. So in many ways, he's that kind of big, larger than life figure. And you talk in your book about him being an epic hero, and you reference the Aeneid, the Roman epic, and you reference the Odyssey and Odysseus, the Greek epic. But also there's a kind of another side where I almost think like he's an everyman hero. This is a story of the hometown kid from Somerville who gets thrown into these epic situations, and this is how he acts, and this is I mean he's an American hero in that way, very
Exactly.
democratic. Yeah, is that how you see him too? Is it
Yeah.
like
Yeah, when I speak of epic hero, I just mean the journeys and the trials that he had to go through to get back home. But you're right. He's just it sounds odd to say, but he was just an ordinary guy. I mean,
yeah.
he liked all you can eat restaurants. He didn't like a lot of fancy. He you would see him, he'd have a toothpick in his mouth. He was always out working in the yard. He owned the dry cleaners. I mean, he fished all the time. He collected earthworms. I mean, he was just a regular dude, so to speak. And that's what I guess drew people to him. He was just like I've traveled with him as well, as you notice in the book, but people were just drawn to him because the way he talked, and he was a classic just storyteller. His memory was phenomenal. So you're right. In that sense, he was just an ordinary guy. And it's
Yeah.
amazing how he was even able to go through all these things and still keep a sense of humor about life and
Right.
dignity.
Yeah, and that's actually I want to make sure people know this aspect of the book. You know, it is based on all these oral histories, but for me, parallel to the story of his life that's coming out in his own words in those oral histories is the story of you gradually getting to know him,
Right.
and you ruminate on your relationship to him, and at one point you say he wasn't really a surrogate father figure, but he was a friend, and
Right.
that friend, and we as readers see that friendship develop. Um, and I mean, that's looking at a relationship, a friendship between this man in his 90s and the experiences he went through, and a young man starting his own family,
Right.
and teaching students in very much in the 21st century. Really interesting aspect of the book. And I know you say many times it's not about you, and it's not, but
Right.
such a satisfying part of it is watching your relationship. And you allude to that time you just sort of mentioned when you go on a trip with him.
Mhm.
And this was for the honor flight program.
Right.
If you could tell us about that, because that's, I think, some of the most moving passages in the book
Right.
have to do with that.
The honor flight was just a way for it was a program, a nonprofit program to allow veterans to go see the memorials in Washington, D.C. You know, a lot of them fought for this country, but haven't even had a chance to see the memorials. Mr. Edwards, a number of times had an opportunity to go, but he just never wanted to go. He had claustrophobia. He didn't like being around too many strangers and going that far. So here I come along years later. I'm thinking it's a brand new thing. I'm like, hey, Mr. Edwards, they've got this honor flight thing. And his wife is like, and I don't want to forget to not mention her, Mrs. Juanita Edwards was phenomenal to support him in all of this. But she was like, yeah, Michael, I tried to get him to go to that years ago. He wouldn't go. And he looked at me that day and he said, you know what? If you go, I'll go. And I was like, wow. He's one, they're entrusting me to go all the way to DC with him in his 90s. And the fact that he ultimately decided to go, he and along with maybe 30 or 40 other World War II veterans, that was one of the best trips I've ever gone on. And to see him at the World War II Memorial telling these same stories to people from all walks of life. I mean, he had crowds around him and he's just telling them these stories. And I remember a joke he made because all day long. And he said, hey, do you want me to push you around in a wheelchair? Because I was getting a little tired and he's just walking. I'm like, wow. If you ever been to the memorials, some of them have steps that go all the way up. So he's just walking up the steps and I'm like, oh, he's like, hey, I can push you around in a wheelchair if you want. But when we got back to the Charleston airport, there was about 1,000 people waiting for all these veterans. And it was like a coming home celebration, one that obviously he never received as a Black soldier. To see him come full circle to being spit on for wearing a World War II uniform and whatnot, to coming home to having people of all races hugging him, kissing him, celebrating with him. He said, wow, now this is a celebration. And that was the type of thing that he deserved, for fighting, for also being a part of the greatest generation.
Yeah.
They were also part of the greatest generation.
And it took 70 years for him to eventually get that what we might even say vindication. I guess you mentioned when he came back from the war, he got a cup of coffee and a donut, I think was his
Right.
the welcome wagon when he got off the ship in California. And then his whole life he spent trying to get, fighting with the government over pensions related to these injuries that he sustained at the hands of American experimenters, not even at the hands of the enemy, but at the hands of the army that did this to him, and was very frustrated.
Right.
And into his 90s was still not getting that vindication, but
Right.
that crowd, and you tell that story so well. It's just a beautiful story as he arrives in Charleston. Now, and of course, his remarkable life did not end with the end of the war. Most of the book is about the war years, but I do want to give you a chance to just sort of gesture towards the rest of his life, because he was more than just the ordinary citizen in Somerville, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. He was an amazing. So you would think that this war would occupy his entire life. Obviously the chemicals are in his body this whole time, and he still had these breakouts. But he was a politician. You know, he saw injustices in Somerville. You know, and he decided, hey, I'm gonna run. I'm gonna do what I can. So he was in politics for a while. Had to face segregation and racism in politics. Another sphere, but the same type of things. You know, officials trying to force him to vote a certain way or force him to vote. You know, similar type of activities. So that he was also a professional jazz musician with the Count Basie band, which is one of the most renowned swing era bands. So he was a professional jazz musician. He traveled the world and did that sort of thing. So he'll tell you he's lived several lives. You got the war thing, you got the professional musicians, politician, and people just invite him to just talk about all of these things because his memory was like, I don't even know how he remembers dates, times, especially with everything that happened. So he lived a full life, and I'm just glad before he passed away, he got to see this book come to completion. And I was nervous as all get, just watching him sitting there as because he read voraciously, and watching him read it and them saying that I did an excellent job capturing him. That was probably the best thing I've ever heard. Watching his wife in tears as she read the book. So, and as he, you know, when he was about to make his transition, he had this book by his bedside, and he was still telling stories even then, and it was just amazing to see. So he was just a truly extraordinary man.
Yeah. So once again, the name of the book is Burned: Conversations with a Black World War II Veteran. If you just Google Michael Owens and Burned, it'll come up. You'll find it. You can get it on Amazon. And Michael, let me thank you again, not only for this interview, but for coming through for Rollins Edwards, for preserving these stories, many of them in his own voice, and getting that book published and making it available to the rest of us. It's just a fantastic story, and I really recommend that as soon as this interview ends, you go over to Amazon and order this book. So Michael, thanks again. I appreciate this. This was very wonderful for you to give of your time, especially during Black History Month. I know there's a lot of, everyone's trying to get on your plate, and I appreciate you letting me sneak on there. So thanks again very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Okay, you too. Take care.